Hey everyone, I'm sure that everybody is still logging in. I see people filing in right now. So um, if you're hearing me, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Just want to let everybody kind of get in, get their water, coffee, whatever, um, to kind of settle in and listen in. So I'll just give everybody a couple minutes here and then we will dive in and get started. Awesome, everybody. If you just joined us, we are just allowing a little time for people to take their virtual seats, get your coffee, get your water, uh, maybe get your notepad if you're one of those people. Um, and then we will get started in just a minute. I'll give everybody till 2:01 and then we'll go. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and start to slowly kick things off here while the remaining folks take their seats. Um, so I hope you're in the right place. I'm excited to have you here. We're here today to talk about practical communication strategies to recruit and retain more caregivers. Um, so just a quick note before I introduce my guest and partner in this webinar today. Um, just wanted to make sure everybody knows, I'm sure you've all been on a million Zoom calls in the last, 3 or 4 years. So you probably don't need this, but just in case, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So we'd love if you would use that as we go through. We have some slides to talk about, some questions for you guys to think about. But please, please, please share your thoughts, your comments, your questions with us, so that way we can make this as interactive of a session as possible, and hopefully you can get as much value out of it as possible. So please use that Q&A button. Also, we are recording this. And so after the presentation, we'll have the recording available. So if there was something you missed, you can go back or feel free to share it with a colleague or what have you. Also, just one quick note before I let Steve introduce himself, related to the Q&A. Our goal today is to share some tips, some best practices, some of the data that we've gathered around how communication and your communication strategy impacts recruiting and retention. But nobody knows everything, right? And there's not necessarily a silver bullet. You have a plan when it comes to recruiting, how you're going to message and when you're going to message around recruiting and retention. But sometimes the plan goes sideways, and you have to change things on the fly, and that happens sometimes. But I think our goal here today is just to give you some ideas, some of the data that you can go on to start thinking about how you want to craft your communication strategy, and hopefully these are helpful tips for you. So with that, I would love to introduce Stephen from Celo. Oh, Stephen, I'd love for you to give us your background and all that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jen. Really great to be on the webinar with you, and thanks for hosting. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Vlok, founder and CEO of Celo. So really excited to get into the details of the webinar today, and a little bit about Celo. So we're a HIPAA compliant messaging app, really created to make instant messaging seamless and easy for home care and healthcare staff. So hopefully today, along with Jen, we can share some of our experiences around what makes communication in the home care setting effective, particularly when you're wanting to talk to caregivers that can often be scattered across the country and often out by themselves and not necessarily in the office with everybody else. So that's sort of some of the key kind of things we're going to talk about today. And yeah, as Jen mentioned, we're really hoping that today's session is pretty dynamic and interactive. So feel free to drop a question in the Q&A section as we go, and we'll do our best to sort of share our experiences along the way.
Awesome. And just out of curiosity, Steve, how did you get into this? How did Celo come about?
Yeah, so I had I guess the pleasure and uh, fortune of growing up in a healthcare family. So my dad's a family physician, and sort of surrounded by other healthcare professionals in my family, and they all had sort of one common complaint. Not that they all like to complain a lot. I think that's not really the lesson here, but I think the technology is often lagging behind in the healthcare industry, and so what they found themselves doing often is reaching for the tools that they were familiar with, sort of text messaging, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, all these tools that are in their personal lives. I mean, how easy it is to pull out your phone and take a picture of something and then share it with a friend. You have exactly the same option when you're sitting in the home care or healthcare industry. So that was often what they were doing. And there's obviously a lot of compliance risks and liabilities around that in regards to HIPAA. So you can't just simply take a photograph on your iPhone and then send it with a colleague. You're facing really, really big penalties, even civil penalties and jail time for a big breach that could happen. But it's not so much about that. It's really how do we get the information to be rich, shared in a secure way, ultimately to have better client or patient outcomes. So that's kind of what the belief behind Celo was. And our sort of philosophy is to make communication really easy and not be all about compliance and security, but actually have a easy to use platform that happens to be HIPAA compliant. So the staff or the users don't really necessarily get bogged down by all the security and compliance. That just happens behind the scenes. And we give them something that's really, really simple to use and easy to message, just like they would with a text message or so on. So that's kind of the story of where it all began.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. I didn't realize that you were coming from a healthcare family, which I think is beautiful and really helps shape the perspective that you bring, to this. So, awesome. Well, I'll give a quick intro about myself. So I'm Jen. I am a co-founder of Augusta Home Care Recruiting. I got my start in this industry, feels like a real long time ago now. I had many fewer gray hairs back then. In 2009, I was working as a caregiver in a memory care community. And then found a company where I could help train caregivers, and was in online training for caregiver, working for a couple different companies since then, basically. So the origin story of Augusta is really that because of me and my two business partners having been in and around the home care and senior care industry for a long time, we started to understand some of the problems, maybe a little bit more deeply and acutely that home care agencies are dealing with around recruiting. I'm happy to talk more about this later with anybody who wants to, but it's really not just that there's not enough caregivers, it's that there's not enough of the right caregivers. So that's basically the problem that we wanted to start to tackle and find some solutions to. So that's a little bit about me. I'm very passionate about home care, to say the least. So yeah. All right, well, let's jump in to the very beginning here. So I wanted to kind of start things out with a definition of a communication strategy, because I think sometimes it's a little wishy-washy about what that actually means. And if you really have a strong definition of what it means, then that's something that you can put into practice and actually have a structure around, which is something that leads your business to be able to scale, right? So communication strategy is a plan for communicating with your target audience. It includes who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, how and when you'll talk to them, what form of communication the content should take, and what channels you should use to share it. So there's a lot in there when it comes to that definition. That's a lot of things that a plan would have. It's also time bound, which is important to think about. I guess what I everybody in the audience, what I would hope that you can start to think about when you see this definition is, what are the different communication strategies that I actually need in my business for specific processes that are happening. So for Steve and I, recruiting and retention were the two main things that came up. That's how a definition of a communication strategy plays in. Those are two of the biggest problem areas. And so therefore there should be a structure around it. But I'd also challenge you, I guess, to think about how could you use this framework in even other parts of your business, and what are those processes that happen at a home care agency that you want to make sure you have that communication strategy in place for. So it's just something to think about as you're kind of taking in the data that we're going to share, and some examples and things. Okay, so I kind of started to allude to this, but we wanted to be a little bit more concrete about it. So why does a communication strategy matter? I mean, as you saw in the definition, it touches on a lot of things, right? It's a pretty robust plan. Some of the main things that came to mind for Steve and I, though, are recruiting first and foremost. It's always a perennially difficult area for our industry. So what it can help you build is a great applicant experience. So if you have a communication strategy that's really tight and your team understands it and people are implementing it on a daily basis, that's something that can greatly impact your applicant experience and really sets the tone for the relationship. That first time that you talk with that applicant, or the first time they hear from you, whether that's online or on the phone or whatever, can set forward a lot of things in your relationship with them. Without a recruiting communication strategy, you also risk being either slow potentially or unprofessional in your communication with candidates, which can leave you open to some other things going sideways, which we're going to touch on a little bit later in this presentation and conversation. So on the point of retention, we're going to dive deep into this, but communication is the most cited reason for why caregivers are leaving their positions. So we'll talk a little bit more about the data behind that. And similar to the hiring process, there could be potential liability issues if you don't have a strategic communication plan, especially when you think about, times in your relationship with your employee that are more tough. If they do something that's against your policies and you have to deal with that, having a plan for that type of communication is just one example. And then, of course, compliance. By the nature of the work that we're doing as an industry, we come into contact with PHI, protected health information, on a regular basis. So that needs to be communicated properly in compliance with HIPAA. So that way you don't have any liability there and you can protect the company. And then I actually already mentioned this one at the bottom there. So non-compliance with hiring and termination, discrimination rules, that also, has the opportunity to leave the company liable, which I guess last thing I'll say about this slide is that it's not, I don't think my intention in writing it was not necessarily to scare everybody. But I think it's good to keep your head out of the sand and know the risks. So that way you can frame this as an opportunity, like these are chances that you have to empower your caregivers with the communication you want them to hear, and use use communication as an empowerment tool for your team. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit of data here. So this may be a stat that some people out there already know, but Home Care Pulse, if you're not familiar with them, that's where I'm getting this data from. They survey and benchmark caregivers and their attitudes, among other things, their attitudes towards their employers. So over this, I found this stat for the past several years, not just like 1 year. It's been a perennial stat that I've been seeing from them, is that the top reason that caregivers leave is due to lack of communication. When you dig into that, what does lack of communication mean? To the caregivers, what it means is not being able to get a hold of the office when they actually need something, not getting a response when they leave a voicemail or a text message, not being notified when their schedule changes. So this little picture here on the right, I've got some of the other top 10 reasons why caregivers leave, but poor communication is number one. So I guess when I think about this data, I think, just a question for the audience out there is, like, I guess, have you seen some of these things in your business, where you feel like you have a plan with your team of how to communicate with caregivers, and then for some reason these things still keep happening? I guess I'd be curious if anyone shares their experience or has any thoughts about that, or how if it's happened to them in the past. So don't be afraid to use that Q&A button there.
Yeah, I think Jen too, just to expand on that a little bit, like if we look at those top 10 reasons in that diagram on the right, a lot of those reasons also directly relate to communication. So obviously number one's the poor communication reason, but if we think about, if we go down that list, hours and scheduling, that can be helped by a good communication tool in terms of changing shifts and getting the right people on shifts and filling them and so on. The training as well, being supported by good communication, lack of recognition. So like, how great is a quick text message to thank someone for their hard work that week, or sending a broadcast out to all staff to actually let them know they're doing a good job and that they're recognized. And that really helps with, just little things like feedback, ideas, openness, and having a dedicated channel for that, we find in our experience is something that caregivers really, really value. So I think communication actually is like almost this overarching theme across all of these different reasons that can actually have an indirect sometimes effect on some of these other reasons. So it's something to keep in mind. And I think if we think about the framework, one other comment that I just make in terms of when you're thinking about setting up a communication framework for your organization is that it's sustainable. So you're not having a really complicated framework that, is good in theory or good in paper, but then sort of drops off after a week or two. It's got to be something that is sustainable, easy to implement, and really sort of almost be no work, or take away a lot of the work in terms of maintaining that strategy or framework. And we'll talk about a little bit as we go through the next few slides.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, the plan that you make for how you communicate to try and solve some of these issues or mitigate them, yeah, it has to be easy to use. It can't be something that's overcomplicated. Otherwise, I mean, that's one way that plans oftentimes go sideways. Simple is hard to do sometimes, but when you can manage it, I've seen great results in my own business. So, okay, so a little bit of background data on recruiting and communication. So I have some stats here from Hirology. They did a really nice survey. I think it was about 6,000 job seekers. There's a link down the bottom of the screen if anybody wants to check it out. So in that survey, they found that up to 59% of candidates will drop out of the application process because it took too long, which is kind of staggering when you take a step back and think about that for a minute. 60% of candidates just don't complete the process because it's taking too long. 41% received another job offer by the time that you reached out to them. So as a part of what we do at Augusta, there have been periods in our business where we have done a lot of phone screening for our customers. So we actually are phone screening caregivers to work for our customers' agencies. And I will tell you, if you, and it's, I'm sure everybody out there has had this experience. It seems so common to me now, where if you don't get back to a caregiver within minutes, maybe an hour of their application, they're gone. They're applying to a lot of jobs at one time, typically. That was another stat that was actually in this same study that I didn't put up here on the screen. But because they're applying to so many jobs, I think that's one of the things that is contributing to them already having an offer on the table by the time that you've reached them. And then the last point I put there down at the bottom, 40% of candidates are ghosting or just basically disappearing, right? Because the company seems disorganized, which I think it's part and parcel to having that communication plan that's easy for the team to implement and easy for the caregiver to understand and make sense of. So yeah, actually, I'm going to pause for just a second because we have a question, or at least somebody writing in here. So yeah, so one, Melissa is sharing that she feels like communication is key and that the caregivers that she wants to hear from and her office staff want to hear from know that we're 24/7 if needed. We try to pick up try to communicate the way each caregiver prefers, but picking up the phone is key. Yeah, so I totally appreciate that. I think Melissa's really sharing an attitude that in terms of being available to caregivers and being as available as possible to caregivers, that I think the data really shows that they want. So thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Okay. Move on to the next screen here. So Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, just sort of segueing into what communication should really look like in a home care or a healthcare setting, particularly when we've got client data or patient data that we're looking after. So I'll just sort of do a bit of a recap. I think most people in the audience will know what HIPAA is, but for the purpose of this presentation, I think it's good to go back to the high level definition. So HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. It's a federal law and it required the creation of national standards to protect sensitive patient health information from being disclosed without the patient's consent or knowledge. And so diving into a little bit of a granular level of detail for that, think about every time you need to share some sort of sensitive patient health information with a colleague or with a family or with another caregiver or physician, not explicitly asking the patient if you can do that to look after them or treat them in a better way. We need to think about HIPAA in terms of how we share that data in a secure way. So that kind of dives into the next topic, which is what is PHI? And PHI is considered to be any identifiable health information that is used, maintained, stored, or transmitted by a HIPAA-covered entity. And a HIPAA-covered entity can be a number of things. It can be a healthcare provider, or a partner, or a third party that works with a healthcare provider, or any sort of business associate that might work with the healthcare provider. And that, if we start thinking about business associates, that's where you may have heard of something called a business associate agreement. And that's really an agreement that needs to be entered into with a vendor or with a health provider or a partner anytime we're thinking about PHI or protected health information. And it's really, really important if we think about HIPAA and PHI in the sort of home care or healthcare landscape, we really need to make sure that caregivers understand what HIPAA is. And there's sort of a kind of a high level comment here, which is, what does it say to candidate employees when you make them take training on HIPAA, but then don't follow the rules? So we really, really want to think, sort of leave you with that question is, it's all good and well to define HIPAA and mention it and train people on what they actually need to do with the HIPAA, but then sending them a text message about such and such a client with their name and their date of birth and maybe their address of where you're going is already straight away a breach of HIPAA. So it's this sort of ironic situation where it's not a great look, especially on the week one of your job, to sort of start to do that kind of behavior. And there's a bunch of options, not just Celo out there as an alternative to creating a safe way to transmit this type of PHI. And then just sort of another comment on that is, we often hear from organizations that they understand the HIPAA requirements, understand what PHI is, and sometimes the tempting course of action is to just avoid sharing PHI. That's kind of one option. And then that kind of almost hamstrings you as an organization and what you can share and how you actually communicate with each other with the information that's required to do the job properly. And then the other angle that sometimes people might take is they have a tool that is just for sharing PHI, and then everything else is on another tool. And what we find with that kind of strategy is it's very hard to have more than one communication channel. You should just have one that you can use for everything. It's more seamless, it's less complicated. And it's a very gray area sometimes, what PHI can actually be defined as. So it's often easier just to have a tool that's already HIPAA compliant, that you can do all your general admin and scheduling changes and all that kind of chat, as well as information or communication that involves PHI. So I think, if you're not across what HIPAA and PHI is, this is a good take-home slide to study and make sure organization understands.
Yeah, I think that's the really good suggestions there. And it also, I mean, since I've been in this industry for a long time, I know what PHI is, but sometimes when we were putting together these slides, I went back and looked at the 18 identifiers and I was like, wow, God, don't forget, PHI is a lot, it's not just things that are medical information about the patient. There's a lot of information that falls under that category. So yeah, I think really, really good stuff. So kind of similarly, focusing now on the recruiting aspect of how compliance and communication kind of matchmake. There's also doing what I do now, helping home care agencies recruit caregivers. I've been looking at a lot of application processes that home care agencies have out there. And some of you out there in the audience may be surprised to learn that I have actually seen questions that ask for a candidate's PHI on the actual application form, or and being collected in a way that's non-compliant, essentially. So be careful about that. That's something that absolutely can happen. One of the areas that's come up in recent history, and it's probably because it's kind of a new thing. Well, maybe not so new anymore, but in 2020 certainly was a big thing, right? Is how you collect information about COVID-related requirements. So what our strategy has been in terms of how we kind of manage that is basically to try and collect an alternate data point from a candidate, as opposed to asking directly about their own PHI. So here's an example here up on the screen. This is how we for the state of California have worded our application question for caregivers, because that's likely something that you want to know about, at least about their attitude towards it. So that way you know how you can match them to your clients. So we worded it as, the state of California has a requirement that you have 3 COVID vaccines, or a medical exemption, or a religious exemption. Do you acknowledge the requirement? So that gives you a good amount of information about what that candidate is, thinking, what their attitude is towards potential vaccine, but it's not asking about any of their medical information. So that's, I guess, just one example of how you can, uh, in your communication plan when you're recruiting, an application is certainly part of the communication plan, is kind of get the information you want, but still make sure you're protecting your business. So next couple of things, we uh, wanted to talk about a few, three different ways that we believe that communication can enhance your employee experience, and maybe some examples around that for you as well. So one thing that we hear a lot from caregivers is that they report feeling undervalued, underappreciated at work. Um, and when you have a communication plan, that framework for how you're going to talk to a brand new candidate who just came into your pipeline, and what you're going to say to them, when you're going to say to them, how you're going to message it, like what's the verbiage that you're using, um, that type of plan in your hiring process, it actually really gives you the opportunity to build in communication that makes the caregiver feel valued. You're shaping the beginning of your relationship with them. I had a while back, I did a series of interviews with a whole bunch of caregivers, and I put a quote from one of the caregivers on the right here. Um, she said, "I wish that my supervisor told me about changes to our care plan software. They also didn't tell me about schedule changes, and those are some of the reasons I left my last job." It kind of supports the data that we saw from Home Care Pulse about why caregivers leave. This is just one example, but it happened to be in an interview that I did a few months ago. So, I figured it was a logical place to share that. Um, but this being said, I did want to also make sure that I share an example of what a communication plan for recruiting would actually look like. And this is I know there's a lot of text on the screen. Just as a reminder, this is being recorded. You can have the slides later, so don't feel like you need to write a whole lot of things down. Um, but I wanted to at least put together concrete examples that you could take away from you of when we're talking about a strategy for communication. What does that actually mean? So, using the questions from the original definition on the left here, who are you talking to? Why are you talking to them? The first thing that I notice in most job advertisement posts, is that uh, the person is a caregiver, a home care aide, depends on your state, oftentimes how people refer to them. But when you're thinking about your plan for communicating, do you want just a caregiver, or do you want somebody who's going to be the best caregiver? I think it's probably the best caregiver, right? So how you message what the role is, I think, makes a difference. Some alternatives here, I have no idea. I didn't look up if any of these are trademarked, so I just came up with them. But Care Pro, Care Hero, Care Star, instead of using the word caregiver, right? Because that means something, and it frames who you want this person to be, right? Um, and why you're talking to them. I see a lot of job posts out there where people say, I'm hiring urgently. I need to hire a caregiver for these specific shifts, which is understandable. There's a totally reasonable, practical reason to do that. What I would challenge you to do when you think about your strategy for communicating with applicants is maybe try reframing it a little bit. You can still say the hours that you need, but the reason that you're hiring care stars is because older adults in our community know that our agency is the best place to receive care, and our employees love working with us. That's why we're hiring. Not because we have an urgent need and our hair is on fire and, oh my God, so and so just called out, right? That sends a very different message than hiring for somebody's career and thinking about, the bigger picture, right? Then just moving down here, how and when will you talk to them? What form of communication and content should that take? So applicants are contacted immediately upon applying, regardless of whether or not they're going to be a good fit for our business needs right now. When scheduling an interview via either your online application, phone, text, email, whatever your mode is, again, thinking about your messaging. So rather than saying, thanks, we don't have any openings right now or that match your needs, you could say something more like, we liked your application and would love to learn more about you and your goals and see how they fit with our needs. So putting the emphasis on making this a caregiver, the employee-centered process, I think it's one of those things that can make all the difference in setting the tone of your relationship. And then finally, what channels should you use to share this message? So I mentioned already, caregivers are applying to 16 jobs at one time, typically. Seems like if you don't get back to them right away, you don't hear from them. So Augusta's recommendation is that applicants should be contacted in the context of their application. Ultimately, if you can give them the ability to self-schedule their interviews, that puts the power and motivation in their hands to pursue a career with your agency, as opposed to a recruiter having to hunt them down, basically, after they see an application come in. And a couple other ways that communication enhances the employee experience. So I hope this isn't too controversial, and feel free to chat in, ask me a question, disagree with me. I would love to have a healthy debate about this. But from my perspective, what I've seen is that sometimes, and it's not across the board, sometimes when a caregiver doesn't show up or calls out at the last minute, we're real frustrated. And I understand it, having been a caregiver and had my teammates call out. I'm picking up the slack. I'm doing a double that day. It's hard on everybody. It's very frustrating. That part is totally understandable. What I think can happen sometimes accidentally within a home care culture is that because of that frustration, a caregiver can start to turn into the villain of our story, when in reality we know that's not true. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have caregivers and older adults. Like that. I think if you take a step back and think about it, big picture, we know that's not the case. But if you have a strategic retention plan, that puts you as the owner, operator, recruiter, whoever it is, retention manager, if you have one of those at your agency, it gives you that opportunity to reframe the story and put together that plan of consistent communication that you want to see. So that way you're getting the most value out of it. And then I think kind of to sum it up, the third point here is really just that having a communication plan for your recruiting and retention, it's an empowering tool for the caregiver, right? It gives them the right message at the right time, to know exactly where they stand with you, what they need to do to be successful, and whether or not that's with your agency or without your agency, because I think oftentimes we kind of push to the side that one pathway of growth for a caregiver could be going back to school, going to do something else with their life that's that's outside of your agency. So I think having that really strong cohesive communication strategy really can be a great tool for the caregiver themselves. Awesome. So Steve, you want to share a little bit?
Yeah, so I think really so sort of to follow on from Jen's view and comments on communication strategy and framework, what I want to talk a little bit about is what that might look like when you start to actually choose the technology or the modes of communication that you might implement as part of your framework. So probably the first comment here is there's no one silver bullet or way of communicating that's going to solve all your needs. And thinking about the audience comment from Melissa, sometimes there's no substitute or replacement for a simple phone call. And that's something to really keep in mind, and you know, and even better, face to face. There's nothing quite like a face to face conversation with somebody. However, obviously, home care is extremely busy, and your caregivers and your staff often highly mobile, often out on their own, and often don't have a lot of face to face with the office staff or administrators. So we think about the concept of instant messaging or text messaging as a really useful form of communication, mainly because it's what people are actually used to in their everyday personal lives. So if we think about instant messaging in a HIPAA compliant context, we really want to think about the wider use of tools. And you know, instant messaging is the most common form of communication, not just in our personal lives, but also in our professional lives, and that's across any industry. It's easy just to send a quick message to somebody because it doesn't interrupt their day. They can answer it when they have any availability or time, and it's often also really information rich. So we can send media, photos, videos, GIFs, you name it, documents, something that really enriches the communication experience. So what I wanted to talk about here is what are the key points when you select an instant messaging product for your staff, and that really extends out to not only your administrators, your executives, your operational staff, but also right out to your caregivers. And then for some organizations, you might even choose to involve the clients, patients, or families as part of that instant messaging journey as well. So four key points. So the first one, you really want to ensure that the patient data or client data or any of the data that's communicated in this platform is encrypted throughout the entire journey. And so, you know, a little bit of a granular level there. That means it's encrypted during the transfer from person A to person B, or, you know, if in a case of a group, person A to B and C, but also at rest, so on the device. And, you know, for anyone thinking, oh, well, WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted, it's encrypted during the transfer, but once it lands on the device, it's not. And at the server level, it's sitting on a Facebook server in a relatively insecure format, and it, you know, they don't have all the agreements and so on. I'll talk about what a BAA means shortly. The second point is really making sure we've got good administrative controls, so restricting the access of any client or patient information to those that are authorized to view it only. So, for example, those healthcare or home care professionals that happen to be looking after the client or the patient. Third point, you really want to ensure that the solution has been audited, vetted, and is robust in terms of its technical, physical, and administrative safeguards that prevent unauthorized access to PHI. And the reason I mentioned those three key safeguards is that is what HIPAA requires. HIPAA requires strong technical safeguards, which is usually all the infrastructure and the encryption of the product. Strong physical safeguards, and that's normally where the server is located or how the data is stored on the server. And so I'll give a specific example about Celo. We're a Microsoft partner, and we trust Microsoft in a relationship to look after our data rather than having to try and do it all ourselves. And so, you know, if we put that in context, Microsoft has an over $1 billion a year expense on cybersecurity. And then the third and possibly the most important safeguard is administrative safeguards. And that's how you set up admin accounts, password control, access to these accounts in terms of who can actually log in and read these messages or receive these messages. And then the fourth and final point is when you select a messaging product for use in home care, you really need to ensure that that provider will sign a BAA or a business associate agreement with you. And this is really an agreement that governs how this PHI is managed and protected in the system. So any provider that is not willing to sign a BAA is not actually HIPAA compliant in the true sense of the definition.
Yeah, that's really super helpful information. A way of thinking about what your needs are. Yeah.
So kind of to expand on that a little bit, this is probably the one take home thing that we've seen in our experience in the industry is we really pride ourselves on making sure that we just provide a simple solution. So don't overcomplicate the framework that you give your staff around how they communicate, particularly when it comes to the messaging tools. So it's got to be easy to use. If it's not easy to use and they have to be trained on it, you're already going to be starting on the back foot. So if they can send a text message, you want to provide something that's just as simple, if not easier to do than that. And so you really want to make sure if you move over to something lightweight and easy to navigate, this will ensure organic uptake. The second point is you have the opportunity to choose a healthcare or a home care specific tool with features that are relevant to your organization or your industry or your use case. So take the opportunity to actually choose a home care or healthcare specific tool rather than an industry generic tool, which, there's plenty of instant messages out there. Choose something that's relevant to your industry. Third one, choose a solution that adds more value to your staff. So think about how do you make their lives easier. So simple things like, okay, I want to send a quick message to everyone to let them know that a shift is available to fill, but I don't want to send it to everybody. I only want to send it to the people that could actually do that shift or are available to do that shift or have the right amount of hours left. So I'm not overcomplicating or over communicating to my staff. It's just the right amount of balance. And then the fourth point, make sure that you actually choose a solution that is HIPAA compliant out of the box. So that means you don't need to do any of the heavy lifting or customization to achieve HIPAA compliance, and a BAA can be signed immediately, and that provider takes care of all the HIPAA obligations as opposed to actually you having to go through your own HIPAA criteria and make sure that you're meeting all the safeguards around the HIPAA compliance.
Awesome. Yeah, I think those are all great points, Steve. And I think many of those points you can also think of in the context um, of all the different processes where you want to implement a communication plan. It's not just recruiting or retention. There may be other areas where you want to have a plan, and thinking about ease of use is definitely part and parcel to it actually being implemented, right? And being consistently implemented. So we did actually have another question that came in, and I'm sorry, it was a couple minutes ago, so I missed it, and now I'm coming back. Lisa was asking, I'll admit that I have made the caregiver, or I have made the caregiver calling out the villain of my story. Can you recommend a couple good ways to reframe this conversation? Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I think I teed up an example on this one just in case that question came up. So I'll come back to the thank you slide in just a second. Okay. So so that what I was talking about earlier was in relation to a retention communication strategy, right? Because the call out is like the number one headache, right? It's the thing that sets everybody's hair on fire and can kind of throw things sideways. So I think what that communication strategy starts with, just as an example, and obviously you should make this your own for your own business. But I think starts with onboarding, and then is something that you can a thread that you can pull through as you continue on with that employee. But I think at the beginning of once they've been hired, they're on their first shift. That's when I think you want to start to talk about what they want to get out of this. And maybe that's something you talk about in your interviews as well, but really start to think into the future and try and help start to match make their goals with the roadmap of how they grow either with your agency or without your agency, because maybe they're the type of person who does want to go back to school, get an LPN or an LVN or something like that. That's a specific track that doesn't necessarily include you, right? Like maybe you can give them some introductions or whatever, but that's just one example, right? But I think the point is within that first month with an employee, you should have a specific way that that you're going to have that goals conversation with them. And I mean, part and parcel to the goals too is also what the expectations are, right? Like It's two sides of the same coin, I think. So making sure that that expectation of how many call outs are allowed and under what circumstance is part of the goals conversation. Like, here's what I need, here's what you want. Let's talk about how we can get there, you know? So, but having that conversation early in the relationship, and then making sure that you're tracking it in some way. Could be a spreadsheet. You know, it doesn't have to be a fancy way to track it necessarily, but write it down. Make sure it's documented for you both of what the expectations are, what their goals are, how you could potentially help them. And then once they start to make a little bit of progress, then it's recognizing that success. Maybe you have it so that way it's even a little bit more of a robust plan where if they're on track with the expectations and their goals, then they're considered for additional pay or benefits. I've heard a lot of home care agencies having some sort of level system and a defined career track within the organization, either to become a lead caregiver, a mentor caregiver, a scheduler, a lot of the different roles within a home care agency. So that's just one example of a retention communication strategy. I basically think that from the most successful agencies that I've seen, they tie the expectations of a caregiver directly to their goals, and it's just one thing. It's not that here's the handbook and you have to follow every policy that we have and it's a one-sided street. It's a two-way street, right? Like, so I think that's one of the big takeaways that I've seen from successful home care agencies. So thank you for that question, Lisa. Got a couple more questions coming in. Steve, this one I think you could help with a lot. One person is asking, why can't we use texting when it comes to HIPAA related information?
Yeah, so I guess key one there is around how do we protect the protected health information. So texting is all in plain text. So if we send a message if say I send a message to Jen, it's all just plain text that goes through our telecommunications provider. It sits on their servers in plain text. It can be intercepted along the journey as well, and all in plain text. And then and that's sort of from like a hacking perspective. But probably what's more telling is the administrative control. So for me to send a text message to Jen, all I need to have is her phone number, and it's very easy to get that phone number wrong. So for example, I send her a message, I think it's going to her, but it's not actually her. It goes to someone else, or to another person, and it's then an unqualified person that's getting this health information, and that's where a breach often can lead to some pretty drastic and stressful outcomes, particularly if it's sensitive content. And it's very, very hard to know where that ends up. And then just having a look at that second question there too, Jen. So someone's asking, what's the main question organizations should ask potential HIPAA compliant mentioning vendors, and how do I make sure that people use the app rather than work around it? Probably two main questions actually. First one is make sure they're actually HIPAA compliant and they'll sign a BAA. So that's sort of the first vetting question. And then the second question is make sure they can show you some data as to how it's currently being used by other customers. So if it's something that you actually want your staff to all use on a daily basis, with any good communication tool needs to be used on a daily basis, you want to ask them for a metric to show the daily average use of the product. So, and for a bit of context, that should sit at a roughly between 50 to 60% of staff to be using it at least daily, and over 90% of staff to be using it at least weekly. And that actually segues into the second question, which is how do you make sure people use the app rather than work around it? It's just got to be easy to use, and you'll see that in the numbers. So ask for a case study, ask for the metrics, and if you're not getting those sort of metrics and you don't have good case studies and testimonials, then people will choose to work around it if it's not easy, and then you really at day zero again, you're gonna have to find something else.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Steve. And I do think we're almost out of time here. We did get one more question, so this is going to be our last one, and then I'm going to wrap it up. But Sophie would like to know how easy it is to get started on something like Celo.
So Yeah, I mean, from a Celo perspective, and I can't talk to any of the other messaging products out there, but from a Celo perspective, we can get everyone onboarded like within a day. Usually it's less than that. So normally the most time consuming part is to get the list of staff and all the profiles from the agency or from the organization. And then once we've got that, we actually, our mechanism is to create all the profiles for the users on your behalf. And then we create something which we call instant onboarding, and all the profiles go out to all the staff. And then at a particular point in time, we onboard everyone in bulk, and then you can just get started straight away. So we normally see, over 90% of staff actually onboarding within the first week, and something like 75% in the first 24 hours. So as long as you can send a text message, you can send a Celo message. That's sort of our kind of motto, so to speak.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Steve. It was a real pleasure getting to do this with you. I hope that everybody in the audience got some good takeaways from Steve and from me. I've got our contact info up on the screen here. If you want to get in touch, we'd certainly love to hear from you and continue the conversation. And so thank you so much, Steve, for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Um,
likewise, Jen, really enjoyed the conversation. So yeah, look forward to more. And thanks everyone in the audience for attending. Yeah, please feel free to reach out for any questions and so on.
awesome. And just if anybody has 5 more minutes to stick around, I'm just going to share a super high level overview of what Augusta does. If you don't have time right now, totally okay. There's our contact our information. You can schedule a little demo time. We can have a chat as well. Feel free to call or email. We also do have something cool that we're doing this March. So if you come and talk to me before the end of the month, you'll get some special. Um, so just wanted to share a little bit about who our customers are. We exclusively work with home care agencies. So we like to think of ourselves as inbound caregiver recruiting, built specifically for home care. So we work with a bunch of franchises. We work with a bunch of independently owned and operated home care agencies. We also prioritized integrating with a lot of partners, because the feedback we got from home care agencies was basically that nobody wants to learn a new system and have another password to worry about. So understandable. So we basically prioritized integrating with everybody that we can related to recruiting the systems that agencies are already pretty much using today. So a little bit of background about us. Augusta was founded by myself and 2 business partners. We are caregivers, home care industry veterans, and we're advised by some really awesome home care agencies and mentors. We have a combined 30 years of experience working with home care agencies and home care agency owners related to recruiting thousands of caregivers. So one of my business partners has a ton of experience under his belt with that. Basically, what we do is we help home care agency owners who are frustrated by applicants who aren't serious about working with your agency. So that's a huge frustration that agency owners are telling me about. And we also talk with a lot of owners and operators who are worried about losing applicants to competitors because of some of the reasons that I talked about, that you have to get back to caregivers so quickly right now with the way the job market is. But interestingly, when I ask owners what they think that we could do to help them recruit more, the answer is usually something about volume, if they just could get more applicants. However, at Augusta, based on the research we've done, everything we've learned, we think that the problem is a little bit more nuanced than just volume of caregivers. I kind of alluded to this earlier, that it's volume of the right caregivers. So what we did is we developed a data-driven method for home care agency owners and operators to get qualified inbound caregiver leads and stop chasing unqualified applicants. So basically helping prioritize the right people so you know what to say to them and when to say it to them. As I mentioned, the problem's a little bit more nuanced than just volume of applicants. And the reason we know that is because we've been studying the data on this, and it's somewhere between 5 and 10% of applications that actually turn into interviews, and somewhere between 1 and 5% of applicants that actually end up getting hired. So I have to credit one of my customers for this. He gave me this saying, I guess. But that means it's harder to get into a home care agency than it is to get into Harvard. And it should not be that way, right? We're not trying to hire people to do PhD research, right? We're trying to hire caring, compassionate, reliable, dependable people who want to grow their career, right? So, so that's what makes us believe that it's not just the volume of applicants. If you just put in more applicants, you're not necessarily going to get the results that you want. So we believe it's part of the process of recruiting that we can make some tweaks to with you and help you get a lot more out of it. The other thing is that recruiters tell us that they're spending at least half of their day just chasing people on the phone, text, email. They're spending so much of their time just trying to get people on the phone to find out whether or not they're qualified. And I guess if you ask a recruiter about it, they would just say, that's my job. But we could make that better, you know? So that's what Augusta has been working on. So I'm not going to share like tons and tons of info today, but these are the basic 3 things that our customers come away with. When home care agency owners work with us, we help them close serious applicants fast. It is shockingly easy to do. Basically, the tool that we made it's a link. It's a URL. So it's nothing fancy. It's literally just a link of a application for employment on steroids. It's got a ton of magic behind it, behind the scenes, but to you and to the applicant, it appears extremely easy to use, which it is. It seamlessly integrates with the systems that I mentioned earlier and your workflows. So we don't try to change how you go about everything related to recruiting. We try and basically fit in with the workflows that make sense. We help stop competitors from basically interviewing your good candidates first. The way we do that is that we know that caregivers are applying to 16 jobs at once right now because they're an economically sensitive group of people. And they don't need a job 2 weeks from now. They need a job today, so they just keep applying and applying and applying until somebody calls them and it seems like it's a good fit. That's kind of a mess but we can break that cycle, which is what Augusta does. So when a qualified applicant, an applicant that you believe is qualified, comes through Augusta, they can self-schedule, which makes a huge difference. We actually see 80% of candidates self-scheduling their interviews when they're qualified. And then finally, when the recruiter comes into the office at the beginning of the day, what they get out of Augusta is basically they know exactly who to talk to, which candidates are qualified. They already know that. They know when to talk with them, and they know the most important things to say to them to get them to come on board. But the only reason we're able to do that is because we've built this specifically for home care. We've spent a ton of time studying what we need to learn from caregivers to get the recruiters the right information. So that way you actually know what's important to them when you have that first either phone or Zoom or in-person meeting with them. So that's all about Augusta. Like I said earlier, if you want to come and learn a little bit more about us, please give me a call, shoot me an email, or schedule a demo, whatever works best for you. And thank you again for your time today. It was a pleasure. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to hear from you soon. Okay, bye.